The Trump administration just activated the largest federal funding cutoff in California history. We're not talking about a single program, we're talking about a complete freeze on payments to sanctuary jurisdictions. San Francisco alone, $1 billion annually at risk. The Bay Area, multiple billions. But here's what Sacramento isn't telling you. California already sends $83 billion more to Washington than it receives. This cutoff doesn't just hurt the state budget, it could trigger the largest tax increase in California history just to keep the lights on. Today we're breaking down exactly which programs lose funding, what it means for your tax bill, and why Governor Newsom's lawsuit might not save you. Let's get into it. Before we dive in, if you're tired of surface-level news coverage that gives you the talking points without the actual policy mechanics, if you're sick of videos that tell you what to think instead of showing you how to think about California politics, then you're in the right place. We don't do partisan theater here. We break down the budget bills, the executive orders, the legal filings, the stuff that actually determines whether your taxes go up or your local services disappear. So if that's what you're looking for, hit subscribe right now. We're building a community of Californians who want to understand the capital power game before it hits their wallet. All right, let's break this down. Here's why you cannot afford to miss this breakdown. Every major news outlet is covering the Trump-California fight as a political drama. Who's winning the messaging war? Who's more defiant? Who looks stronger on immigration? But no one is explaining the actual policy mechanics that determine whether your taxes go up or your local services get cut. This video provides 3 things you won't find anywhere else. First, the specific federal funding streams at risk. We're not talking vague federal dollars, we're identifying the exact grant programs Trump can legally target and which ones require congressional approval he doesn't have. Second, the Sacramento power calculation. Newsom is filing lawsuits, but he's also quietly preparing budget alternatives. We obtain details from legislative analysts on the contingency plans being drafted right now, including potential tax increases and service cuts already on the table. Third, the timeline that matters. The court temporarily halted the cutoff until February 6, 2026. That's a 48-hour reprieve, not a victory. We're breaking down the 3 most likely legal outcomes and what each means for California's budget within the next 90 days. And here's a myth you need to understand right now. You'll hear claims that California can easily replace federal funding because the state sends more to Washington than it receives. That's technically true. California sends $83 billion more in taxes than it receives in grants. But here's the reality. That imbalance is based on income taxes paid by high earners and corporations, not by the average resident. The federal grants being cut fund programs for low-income Californians, childcare, public housing, welfare assistance. Replacing those grants means raising taxes on everyone, including the middle class, while wealthy residents consider leaving the state entirely. The math doesn't work as cleanly as Sacramento claims. This is the analysis you need to understand what's actually happening and what it means for your wallet over the next 6 months. So let's start with what actually happened on February 1st. Trump announced an immediate halt to federal payments to sanctuary jurisdictions, expanding the policy from cities to entire states. On January 13th through 14th, 2026, Trump stated at the Detroit Economic Club and in subsequent social media posts that effective February 1st, no more payments to states for their corrupt criminal protection centers. The policy targets California, New York, and Illinois, states with sanctuary city policies that limit local cooperation with immigration and customs enforcement. Unlike previous attempts in his first term that targeted individual cities, this order threatens to cut funding to entire states if any jurisdiction within them maintains sanctuary policies. Now here's the key detail that makes this different from everything that came before. The administration has not yet specified which federal funding streams will be cut. Think about that for a second. They've announced a funding cutoff but haven't told California which programs are losing money. Potential targets include temporary assistance for needy families, that's TANF, child care block grants, community development block grants, that's CDBG, and Byrne Justice Assistance Grants, that's JAG for public safety. San Francisco alone receives approximately $1 billion annually in federal funding across all programs. The broader Bay Area receives multiple billions. So why would they announce a cutoff without specifying which programs? This is strategic. By threatening all federal funding without detailing which programs, the administration maximizes pressure on state officials while maintaining flexibility to target the most politically vulnerable programs. Expect the administration to release specific cuts in phases, starting with programs that have the weakest legal protections and the strongest political optics, likely public safety grants, and programs with fraud concerns. They want Sacramento officials sitting there running nightmare scenarios on every single program, not knowing where the axe is going to fall. That uncertainty itself is a weapon. But before we analyze which programs are most at risk, we need to understand the legal foundation Trump is using to justify these cuts and why it's different from what courts blocked 5 years ago. Federal courts blocked similar sanctuary funding cuts in 2017 through 2019, but Trump's 2026 approach uses different legal authorities that may withstand judicial review. During Trump's first term, courts ruled that the administration violated the spending clause by adding new immigration enforcement conditions to existing federal grants without congressional authorization. The Supreme Court let lower court injunctions stand, effectively ending those efforts. However, the current approach differs in 3 critical ways. First, it frames the cuts as enforcement of existing laws rather than new conditions. Second, it ties funding cuts to allegations of fraud and mismanagement in state programs like Medicaid and homeless services alongside sanctuary policies. Third, it targets state governments directly rather than individual cities, creating different legal standing issues. These distinctions matter because they change the constitutional analysis that courts have to apply. Now, a federal court issued a temporary restraining order on February 1st, halting the funding cuts until at least February 6, 2026. California Attorney General Rob Bonta filed the lawsuit within hours of Trump's announcement, arguing the cuts violate the spending clause and the 10th Amendment. Additional states joined the lawsuit. But here's what you need to understand about this 48-hour extension. It's procedural, not substantive. The court needs time to review the legal claims, but the injunction could be lifted if the administration demonstrates it's enforcing existing statutory requirements rather than creating new ones. The key legal question is this: can the administration use its executive authority to withhold funding for non-compliance with existing immigration law versus adding new conditions that require congressional approval? If the administration wins this distinction, the cuts could proceed while appeals continue. And here's the long-term outlook. This likely ends at the Supreme Court. The current court has shown deference to executive authority over immigration enforcement and may rule that states cannot both refuse to cooperate with federal immigration law and demand federal funding. If the Supreme Court rules for the administration, California faces a permanent funding cut unless it changes sanctuary policies. If the court rules for California, the administration will escalate through other mechanisms, expect fraud investigations, audits, and conditional waivers for federal programs. Either way, this fight is just beginning. So assuming the cuts eventually proceed, either fully or partially, let's break down what that actually means for your taxes and your community's safety. California faces an impossible budget equation: replace billions in federal funding, cut services, or implement the largest state tax increase in modern history. California's 2026-2027 budget is already operating with tight margins. The state weathered recent deficits by drawing down reserves and making one-time cuts. If the Trump administration cuts $15 to $20 billion in federal grants, and that's a mid-range estimate targeting major programs, California cannot absorb those losses without either significant service cuts or new revenue sources. Let's get specific about which programs are at risk. Medicaid, or Medi-Cal as we call it in California. California receives approximately $90 billion annually in federal Medicaid matching funds. While core Medicaid funding is protected by statute, enhanced federal matching rates, and supplemental grants, approximately $10 billion could be classified as discretionary and vulnerable to cuts. TANF and child care. California receives approximately $3 billion annually for temporary assistance for needy families and child care subsidies. These are block grants with significant administrative discretion, making them easier targets for executive action. Public safety grants. Byrne JAG grants provide approximately $30 million annually to California law enforcement agencies. Cutting these grants directly impacts police departments in sanctuary cities. Community development, CDBG grants, provide approximately $500 million annually for housing, infrastructure, and community services in low-income areas. Now let's do the tax math. If California replaces $20 billion in lost federal funding through state revenue, it needs to raise approximately $2,300 per household annually. That's based on California's 8.7 million households. Think about what that means. That's equivalent to a 1% across-the-board income tax increase or a 0.75% sales tax increase statewide. Alternatively, California could implement targeted tax increases on high earners, but those are the same taxpayers already leaving the state due to high costs of living. And this brings us to the exodus problem. California has experienced net domestic outmigration for several years, with high-income households moving to Texas, Florida, Nevada, and other low-tax states. If California implements significant tax increases to replace federal funding, the exodus accelerates. This creates a doom loop. Higher taxes drive out wealthy residents, reducing state revenue, requiring even higher taxes on remaining residents, driving out more taxpayers. At some point, California loses its ability to replace federal funding through state taxes alone. You can see how this spirals. If California doesn't raise taxes, it must cut services. The programs most likely to face cuts are the same ones losing federal funding: welfare assistance, childcare, public housing, and homeless services. This creates immediate hardship for low-income Californians and worsens the state's homelessness crisis, which is already a political liability for Governor Newsom. So Sacramento is currently modeling 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, aggressive litigation delays cuts long enough for a political resolution. Maybe Trump leaves office in 2029, or maybe Congress intervenes. Scenario 2, California implements temporary tax increases branded as emergency response to federal overreach, betting that voters blame Trump rather than Sacramento. Scenario 3, California forces sanctuary cities to partially comply with federal immigration requests to minimize funding cuts while maintaining political cover through lawsuits. The most likely outcome is a hybrid: partial compliance in exchange for partial restoration of funding, with Sacramento raising some taxes to cover remaining gaps while blaming Washington for the increases. But taxes aren't the only concern. The sanctuary funding fight is also driving major changes to public safety policy, and the impacts might surprise you. The safety debate over sanctuary policies and funding cuts breaks down along predictable political lines, but the actual evidence is more complicated than either side admits. Trump administration officials argue that sanctuary policies protect dangerous criminals by preventing local law enforcement from cooperating with ICE on deportations. They point to specific cases where undocumented immigrants with criminal records committed additional crimes after being released by local authorities instead of being turned over to ICE. The funding cuts are framed as forcing compliance with immigration law and preventing criminal protection centers from operating with federal subsidies. Studies by the Center for Immigration Studies, which is a restrictionist think tank, have documented cases where sanctuary jurisdictions released individuals with ICE detainers who later committed violent crimes. The argument is that sanctuary policies create unnecessary public safety risks by preventing the removal of criminal non-citizens. On the other side, immigrant rights advocates and California officials argue that sanctuary policies improve public safety by encouraging undocumented immigrants to cooperate with police without fear of deportation. If immigrants fear that any interaction with law enforcement could lead to ICE detention, They won't report crimes, serve as witnesses, or cooperate with investigations. This makes communities less safe overall. Additionally, local law enforcement agencies argue that acting as immigration enforcers erodes community trust and diverts resources from core public safety missions. Research from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and Academic Studies have found no evidence that sanctuary policies increase crime rates. Some studies suggest crime rates are actually lower in sanctuary cities compared to non-sanctuary cities with similar demographics, though causation is difficult to establish. But here's where it gets complicated. If the Trump administration cuts Byrne JAG grants and other public safety funding to sanctuary jurisdictions, those jurisdictions lose resources for policing, prosecution, and crime prevention programs. This could increase crime rates not because of sanctuary policies themselves, but because of reduced law enforcement capacity. If crime increases in sanctuary cities after funding cuts, both sides will claim vindication. Trump officials will say sanctuary policies caused the increase, while California officials will say federal funding cuts caused the increase. The real safety risk isn't about immigration enforcement policy, it's about the chaos created by rapid policy shifts and funding uncertainty. Police departments operate on annual budgets with multi-year commitments for personnel and equipment. If federal grants are cut mid-cycle, departments face immediate shortfalls that force layoffs, hiring freezes, and canceled programs. Fire departments, emergency services, and disaster response programs face similar disruptions. The uncertainty itself creates risks, regardless of the underlying policy debate. Expect a wave of local-level defections from sanctuary policies over the next 6 months, while San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Sacramento will hold the line politically. Smaller cities and counties will quietly begin cooperating with ICE to avoid federal funding cuts. This creates a patchwork enforcement landscape where immigration enforcement varies dramatically by jurisdiction. Some California counties already refuse to adopt sanctuary policies. Expect those counties to receive favorable treatment in federal grant allocations, creating political pressure on neighboring sanctuary jurisdictions. The end result is a de facto partial compliance strategy where California maintains sanctuary branding at the state level, while individual jurisdictions make their own enforcement decisions. So how is Sacramento actually responding to this unprecedented federal pressure? Let's break down Newsom's strategy and whether it has any chance of succeeding. Governor Newsom is pursuing a 3-track strategy: litigation, public relations, and quiet negotiation. But all 3 tracks face significant obstacles. Track 1 is litigation. California filed a federal lawsuit within hours of Trump's announcement, arguing the funding cuts violate constitutional limits on executive power. Attorney General Rob Bonta characterized the cuts as unlawful coercion designed to force states to implement federal immigration policy. The lawsuit seeks a permanent injunction blocking the cuts. However, the litigation strategy has a major weakness: time. Even if California eventually wins in court, federal appeals could take 12 to 18 months. During that time, the funding cuts may proceed unless courts issue preliminary injunctions. And if the Supreme Court rules for the administration, California loses permanently. Track 2 is public relations. Newsom is framing the fight as Trump's war on California, emphasizing that California sends $83 billion more to Washington than it receives in federal spending. The messaging strategy aims to position California as a victim of political retaliation rather than as a state refusing to comply with federal law. This approach works politically within California. Newsom's approval ratings improve when he fights with Trump, but it doesn't solve the budget problem. Winning the messaging war doesn't replace lost funding. Track 3 is quiet negotiation. Behind the scenes, California officials are exploring partial compliance options that could restore some federal funding without abandoning sanctuary policies entirely. Options include allowing ICE access to state prison populations who are already in custody and would be deported upon release anyway, cooperating on specific violent crime cases while maintaining protections for minor offenses, and implementing Trust Act policies that balance public safety concerns with immigrant protections. These negotiations are politically risky for Newsom because his progressive base views any cooperation with Trump's immigration agenda as betrayal. Newsom faces a three-way dilemma. If he maintains absolute resistance to immigration enforcement, California loses billions in funding and faces budget cuts or tax increases. If he negotiates partial compliance, his 2028 presidential ambitions suffer because progressive voters view him as capitulating to Trump. If he raises taxes to replace federal funding, he accelerates the exodus of wealthy residents and worsens California's economic challenges. None of these options are good politics, which is why Newsom is currently pursuing all three tracks simultaneously while hoping for a legal victory that makes the other options unnecessary. The Trump administration is betting that California's budget pressures will force compliance regardless of court rulings. Even if California wins preliminary injunctions, the threat of future cuts creates uncertainty that affects state budget planning. Additionally, the administration is expanding fraud investigations into California programs, creating alternative legal justifications for cutting funding beyond sanctuary policies. If audits uncover significant fraud in Medi-Cal or other programs, which is likely given the size and complexity of California's social programs, the administration gains new leverage to justify funding cuts on fiscal grounds rather than immigration grounds. The most likely outcome over the next 90 days is a legal stalemate where courts issue temporary injunctions maintaining current funding levels while the case proceeds through appeals. During this period, both sides engage in political warfare. Trump uses executive actions and investigations to pressure California, while Newsom uses lawsuits and media campaigns to resist. The actual policy resolution won't come until late 2026 or 2027 when courts issue final rulings or political circumstances change. In the meantime, California residents face uncertainty about future tax liabilities and service availability while both governments blame each other for the chaos. Here's what you need to understand about the sanctuary funding fight. This isn't getting resolved quickly. California will fight in court, Trump will push forward with cuts, and the case will drag through the federal judiciary for months or years. In the meantime, you're caught in the middle. Your tax bill is at risk. California cannot replace $15 to $20 billion in federal funding without either cutting services or raising taxes. Even if California wins in court eventually, the state may implement temporary tax increases to cover the gap during litigation. Those temporary taxes have a way of becoming permanent. Your local services are at risk. Police departments, fire services, child care programs, and public health services all depend on federal grants that could be cut. Even if the state replaces some of the lost funding, it won't replace all of it, and local governments will face budget shortfalls. Your community's safety landscape is changing. Some jurisdictions will quietly start cooperating with immigration enforcement to preserve federal funding. Other jurisdictions will resist and face the fiscal consequences. This creates a patchwork system where immigration enforcement varies dramatically depending on which city or county you live in. The most important takeaway: don't believe either side's simple narrative. This isn't a story about courageous resistance or necessary enforcement. This is a story about incompatible policy priorities colliding at the expense of taxpayers and communities caught in the middle. Here's what to watch over the next 30 days that will signal where this fight is actually heading. First, watch for the administration's detailed list of which programs are losing funding. If they target Medicaid supplemental payments first, it signals they're going for maximum fiscal impact. If they target Byrne JAG grants first, it signals they're focused on public safety optics. The order of cuts tells you their strategic priority. Second, watch for defections among California cities and counties. If you start seeing news about sheriffs in Central Valley counties or Inland Empire jurisdictions quietly agreeing to cooperate with ICE, that's a signal that local officials are breaking ranks with Sacramento to preserve funding. Third, watch for Sacramento's budget trailer bills in late February or March. Those bills will reveal whether the state is preparing tax increases or service cuts to address potential funding losses. The language in those bills tells you what Sacramento actually believes will happen versus what Newsom says publicly. Fourth, watch the federal court docket. If the judge extends the preliminary injunction beyond February 6th for an extended period, California buys time. If the injunction is lifted quickly, the funding cuts start immediately and pressure mounts. Follow these 4 indicators and you'll understand where this fight is heading before the mainstream media figures it out. If this analysis gave you information you couldn't find anywhere else, subscribe to the channel. We track California policy moves before they become headlines, break down budget bills before they're voted on, and explain the Sacramento power game that determines your taxes and services. We don't do partisan cheerleading. We don't waste your time with speculation disguised as news. We do policy analysis for people who want to understand what's actually happening and what it means for their wallet. Comment below if you have questions about specific programs or if you're seeing impacts in your community. We'll address the most common questions in follow-up coverage. Thanks for watching. Stay informed.